just want you to know just want you to know we are here for you anytime. We welcome you to this first wrap-up session of the MLMP and want you to know that you can reach out to us either via that email address, the info@mlmp.org is where you can send us an email. We'll answer your questions about data collection, data entry, anything that you might be wondering about. And I also want to remind you about all the resources that are on our website, mlmp.org. You can learn about trainings we have coming up there. We have our activities and data sheets. You can see and enter your data, read about publications that have been published using MLMP data. You can find resources for refreshing your training, or if you need some help with egg larvae identification, you can find information about that there, read our newsletters, see images in our gallery, all kinds of great things on that website. So make sure you use that as a resource and then also know that we are here to help you anytime. All right, next slide. All right, so who's here today and who signed up for this training? You met the four of us, the four instructors. We have over 100 MLMP volunteers who are signed up and joining us today. You come from 26 states, so over half of the United States, and one Canadian province. So you can see all the different states represented there, a really wide geographic spread of folks tuning in from all over. So thank you for being here. We're really glad you're here and look forward to celebrating this wrap-up session with you. All right, just to go over a couple of session logistics to help us out today. If you have questions while we're moving about this session, just feel free to put them in the Q&A box. If you put questions in the chat box, we may or may not see them. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A option. That's where you should put questions, and then we'll have several opportunities throughout the session during question breaks, and we're going to have breakout rooms at the end. We'll have some follow-up communication that will be answering those content questions. So just pop them in there and send them to all panelists, and we'll be sure to get them and collate them. If you're having technical difficulties, Alyssa, Katie Lynn, and I are happy to help. Just message us. We'll be happy to do what we can to help you out. And then we ask that you avoid distracting chat conversations during these group activities because sometimes it can be hard to focus both on all ends if we have a lot of chat going on while we're kind of working together as a group. And just so you know, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project website in the near future. So watch for that there. All right, so what's on the agenda today? We are going to, it seems timing is appropriate to have a little polling about some MLMP things in our next section. We'll be doing that. We're going to recognize some of our volunteers in a few minutes. We'll have some general updates as well as a sharing out about recent research that has used MLMP data. We'll have a few reminders about that data collection and entry. And then we're going to have a Q&A block at the end, along with a couple of other spots where we'll have some time for Q&A. And finally, at the end of our session, we'll have time to share some stories among you, the volunteers, and some of your impressions of the year during that breakout session where we'll go into separate rooms and just have a chance to chat among the various volunteers that are on the call.
All right, so I'm going to launch a quick polling. I see some of you are saying that the Q&A is off. I just flipped a quick setting on there, so feel free to try and open that again and make sure that it's working. I'm going to launch a poll here for you. There'll be just a quick series of questions. You might have seen some of them already when we asked for the RSVP, but just this is a really good opportunity for us to collect some data and kind of make sure that we're hitting all the things we want to hit with the MLMP. So I'm gonna launch that quickly for you. And that should pop up in the middle of your screen. Awesome. I see some answers coming in, so keep throwing those in there. Shouldn't take too long. We'll just give it a few minutes or so for folks to answer. And Brett, thank you. I see that you were able to access the Q&A, so it looks like Q&A should be good to go as well.
Alyssa,
Awesome.
I'm not sure how we should interpret people maybe wanting more email communication.
Are you being kind? That's the real question. Maybe it depends. I know we did ask when you all signed up that if you were interested in more email communications, what that could potentially look like for you. So just trying to collect some of that info. But yes, good point. More condensed emails, more info, condensed emails, more than quantity. Thank you, Christy. Awesome. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, guys. I also see that the Q&A is live and ready to roll. The one thing I did want to point out, and I'm going to use Belinda's example and Dennis's example here, you'll see a little thumbs up at the bottom of each question. If there's a question that you have as well, or you want to ask the same question, instead of typing it in twice, you could just hit that little thumbs up button and it's going to do something called upvote. And then we'll know that there's multiple people interested in the same question so that we might be able to address some of the ones that have a lot of interest in terms of time. And so with that, I'm going to flip it back on over to Annie or maybe Karen. I can't remember. Karen.
Yeah, I'm next.
Awesome.
Thanks, Alyssa. And thanks again, everybody. It's really great to have you here. I saw Steve Glass is on, and that's a picture of Steve right there on the very far right. But anyway, a quick wrap up of what you all did this year. There were 214 different sites being monitored by MLMP volunteers, and that was 147 individuals / teams. So when we download, there's one name associated with each site. So we know that there are often multiple people monitoring the site. So it's just either individuals or teams of people that are monitoring those 214 sites. And you conducted 2,131 monitoring events this summer. So that is really amazing when you consider that each monitoring event takes 30 minutes to maybe 2 hours. So that's a ton of investment. We really, really appreciate all of your time. And you were doing this in 30 states. And we had fewer monarchs reared for activity 3 this year, which is the monarch survival study where you bring the caterpillars into your houses. A lot of that is because you probably weren't finding a lot of 4th and 5th instars out there. There was kind of a low year for monarchs. So that was a lower number than other years, but still a pretty good number. So that's kind of a wrap up of the year. And one of the things I wanted to point out when I love putting pictures on slides, but this picture is our team that monitors at the UW-Madison Arboretum, and that's Steve Glass, my monitoring buddy right there. But showing that we know that a lot of people join your teams when you come. So there are 2 other people. Steve's brother is there, and Laura Jackson, who's the director of the Tallgrass Prairie Center. So lots and lots of people join you and us when we go out to monitor. So that's kind of fun. All right, the next slide shows our participation by state, and there are all the states across on the bottom, and the taller, darker blue lines on this graph are the number of sites that were monitored in each state, and the lighter blue color is the volunteers that were associated with those sites. So you can see our state engagement ranges from 1 volunteer in Alabama and Connecticut, monitoring 1 site. So that's really great. If you find your state at the bottom there and you're a part of a state that doesn't have a lot of volunteers, we would love your help in recruiting more people from your state, because we can really learn a lot when we have a lot of people from a state. But if you are the only one from your state, thank you for representing your state. It's really important to get this geographic spread of data. And then the next slide, I just wanted to recognize people who have been monitoring for a long, long time with the MLMP. So we can download this from the database, and each of you are associated with a year at your different sites. So here are our volunteers who have been monitoring for over 15 years. So you got on here if you were in your 16th year in 2024. And I just put 2024 volunteers up here, people who were associated with a site. And the dark bolded people are, I think, here today. So kudos to all of you for monitoring for a long, long time with the MLMP. It's really exciting to have these long-term data. We were just talking about this before you all came on, that I'm the only one from 1996, because that's the year that we just did it with my lab at the University of Minnesota. Then 1997 was the next year that we actually recruited volunteers from all over the country. So Susan and Gail, thanks for hanging in there. You were there from the very, very beginning of the MLMP. We appreciate that. All right, next slide. Thanks for running. Oh, and that picture is me thanking you for all of your help behind the world's tallest milkweed plant. All right, there. And just a little bit of a wrap up. We haven't done a deep dive into the data from 2024 yet. So what I've done here is just kind of a summary, and I'm only going to do this for 2 states, but just to kind of show you what is going on. You probably had people tell you this year, if people know that you're into monarchs, they were probably telling you that they weren't seeing very many monarchs. And this is what we saw in Wisconsin, where we had the most sites being monitored this summer. So it's pretty, there are a lot of people collecting data, a lot of milkweed plants being monitored in Wisconsin. So if you look at, let's look at 2023 first, which is the upper right-hand corner here. This is what a typical year looks like. So the monarchs come back from the south, the new generation that's born in the south. So the first generation of the year comes back, usually gets to Wisconsin about the middle of May. And then they start laying eggs, and those butterflies die off. And then the next generation starts up, and we get the second and third generation kind of makes one peak, a second peak that's tall, usually taller than the first peak. So last year was a really typical year, 2023. You could see similar pattern in 2022 and 2021. But for some reason, this year was different. We had monarchs coming back in numbers very similar to what they were last year. You can see that peak in the first hump on the graph goes up to like 0.15, even a little higher than it did last year in 2023. But instead of the numbers getting higher in the second and third generations in 2024, they were a lot lower. And we're still working to figure out what happened there. We won't really know until we pull together all of the weather data. What was unusual about this year is we had a ton of rain in June. It was just really wet. We had like 60, 70% more rain than we would in a normal June. And it's possible that those butterflies that were emerging just had trouble. It was too rainy, so they couldn't lay their full complement of eggs. But again, we won't really know until we do a more detailed analysis of the data. But if you felt like you were seeing fewer monarchs, you were right. And then the next graph, or the next collection of graphs, is just to show you that this wasn't, so this is the same picture except of Minnesota instead of Wisconsin. We didn't have quite as many sites or as many milkweed plants being monitored in Minnesota, but it wasn't as bad. So you can see that actually the second peak, except for that really high number on the 12th of May, in the first blue bar in the graph of 2024 is really high. That's probably one or two people who saw the first monarchs coming back, and there weren't a lot of milkweed plants around, so monarchs laid a lot of eggs on a few plants. So the situation was really geographically specific this year. So we'll kind of see how all of that plays out as the monarchs move south and start arriving in Mexico. Probably in the next 3 or 4 days, they'll start getting to Mexico. So just a picture of what we saw this year. The numbers are, we didn't have a great year. It was pretty bad the second half in Wisconsin and a few other states, but there were some places where monarch numbers looked okay. And I think that is it. Yeah, now Annie's going to talk to us about what we're seeing in the fall.
Yeah, so I was going to share a couple of maps from our partners over at Journey North. I've included the Journey North website there, journeynorth.org. And the maps that you'll see here are great indicators of the pace of migration. So many of you probably know that monarchs roost overnight on their way down to central Mexico or coastal California, where they overwinter. And these roosts help show us the pace of migration and the location. So on this Journey North map, you can see in the lower right-hand corner the scale. This is a static map. It's not a live map, but you can see the scale with the different shades of green indicating observations submitted by citizen scientists from all these different places. The dots that have the small white circle indicate a report that also includes a photo, which is really helpful for verification. And to the left, the inset has an observation from Oklahoma, and you can see the writing's very small, but I just wanted to point out that that's what, when you hover over those dots on the Journey North maps, which you can find on the website, those white circles indicate a photo, and all of those dots are different reports submitted by citizen scientists of, in this case, fall roosts. So these are really helpful maps with helping show where the monarchs are currently located. You can see there are several reports from about northern Mexico, which those reports that are being circled with that white arrow are about 400 miles or so away from the central Mexican overwintering sites, and have an indication that we're getting close to the monarchs arriving at their overwintering sites, but we aren't quite there yet. Typically, this coincides with about this time of year. So when we were planning a date for our wrap up, we thought it might be kind of exciting to have that be close to when the monarchs will hopefully arrive at the overwintering sites. All right, next slide. So here are two of those Journey North Monarch Fall Roost maps side by side, one from 2003 and the other from this year, 2004, as of yesterday. I pulled these maps yesterday. So you can see the one on the left has a lot more dots, almost double the number of roost reports that were contributed by volunteers who made observations and submitted those reports. compared to this year where we're only at about 150 roost reports, and that is likely due to what Karen was talking about, just lower numbers in general, hence meaning fewer roost reports. And I wanted to point out this report in particular is from our partners down in Mexico from Carrillo Real. This report was as of October 19th, but about 1,000 monarchs reported in a roosting site. Again, this is probably about 400 miles away from the central Mexico overwintering sites. So they're getting closer, not quite there yet, or we haven't received reports so far that they're there, but I suspect any day now. And finally, I wanted to share with you just if you go to the Journey North website, this is a really great way to follow along with the migration because those maps that I showed you, while they are static on our presentation here today, they're in real time. So if a volunteer submits a report, you can see it there immediately. And I circled the projects in the orange circle, thanks, Alyssa, at the top. Um, Monarchs are the primary species that is tracked by Journey North citizen scientists, but there are other species as well. And you can check them all out there. I also wanted to point out the news tab on the Journey North site. If you go to that, you'll see these reports that are written weekly now during the fall migration and then again in the spring migration that will help kind of collect the reports that have been coming in the past week or so and give a snapshot of where the monarchs are and how the migration is progressing. So if you haven't signed up for those news updates, you can do that by clicking on any of the reports and then look for the blue button that I put the big blue arrow next to. It's kind of a small little teeny tiny little subscribe button, but that's where you would click and enter your email address, and then you would get these reports delivered to your email inbox, or you could also just go to the website, check them out there. Journey North, like MLMP, also has a social media presence, Facebook, Instagram. So you can click one of those as well, and you can also see the reports from those avenues. So, and I think, trying to remember the next slide, I believe we are
I'm
ready.
up next, but I did want to just chime in, Annie. Somebody was just asking if we knew if there was going to be an update to the MLMP website, or excuse me, not the MLMP, the Journey North website at all. I know they were working through a transition on that.
Yeah, that is the hope, and it's in transition right now. So yes, that is still a hope, and we're kind of working through a transition with the Journey North team and website over at the UW Arboretum. So yes.
Awesome, thank you. And then just one other quick question about like roosting and migration. Just wanted to confirm that monarchs migrate individually and only roost together at night. And if there's any research on what makes a good nighttime roost site.
Yeah, so confirmed on that. Monarchs migrate individually during the day and then roost together at night in clusters. And chime in here, Karen, Alyssa, or Katie, but also typically a roost site would be one that is sheltered from the wind, that they're collecting together, sheltered from the wind. And Karen, you want to add anything? I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, wind shelter is good. Often it's on a kind of a long row of trees that the monarchs will roost, but not always. Sometimes they'll find an individual tree, and they seem to go to any species of tree. So there have been some analyses, and that's something let's make a note to put that in a follow-up, Alyssa and Katie Lynn. I can't off the top of my head reference a paper, but there is a paper published about that we will send to all of you. Great question.
Thank you. Good question. Yeah, I just wanted to throw. Oh, go ahead.
Really quick characteristic is roost sites are often near good nectar patches, so next to a prairie or something.
Great, good question, great questions. And I know there's more questions in here and don't think that we haven't seen them, just trying to chime in on ones that are relevant as we're going through. I'm going to touch quickly, just, I know this is a big topic, but just touch quickly on kind of the status and protections for monarchs across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So in Canada in 2016, monarchs were listed as a species of special concern. As of December of 2023, they were upgraded under their endangered version of Endangered Species Act, which is called the SARA Act, or the Species at Risk Act, to endangered in December of 2023. And so they're working through the processes of coming up with a recovery plan on their end in this past year's time frame. And a quick note on that different provinces have different rules and levels of enforcement in regards to what that looks like. In the United States, and I'll dive a little bit more into what this timeline looks like here in just a second, they were warranted but precluded, so they were a candidate species in 2020. And again, I'll get a little bit more into that here in a minute. In Mexico, there's a natural protected area that was established and expanded, so that's a monarch butterfly biosphere reserve. It's also a World Heritage Site, and they do have some specific species under special protection there as well. And then you probably have also heard of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, so the IUCN. In 2021, they were migratory monarchs specifically were listed as endangered. And then there was a review of that, and then they were downgraded in 2023 to vulnerable. That was changed to vulnerable based off of looking at kind of like a different data set that was specifically for the last 10 years. And Karen, I'm sure you can dive a little bit more deeply into that if we have some specific questions on that as well. And then I did want to note as well that the actual monarch migration under the IUCN is what is considered as an endangered phenomenon. So kind of a separate thing than the actual migratory species. But if you had anything to add on that, Karen, feel free.
No, if people have questions, we can go more into it later, but you did a great job explaining it, Alyssa.
So there's a lot of complicated things. We do have to think this is a species that spans multiple countries, right? So there's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of cooperation that involves, you know, the conservation and recovery of monarch population. So a lot goes into it. The IUCN is not a regulatory agency, so it doesn't necessarily play bearing on these other aspects as well. As far as the US and kind of where we're at in the world of monarchs for the Endangered Species Act, I'll kind of just bring you back to 2014. So as far as the timeline, in 2014, the petition was actually presented to the Fish and Wildlife Service for monarchs to be listed as on the Endangered Species Act. In 2015, 2018, they went through what's called a species status assessment, or an SSA. So that's where they're looking at the populations, they're assessing the populations, gathering information to help them make their decision. And in that process, they also created something called the Monarch Conservation Database, because again, this is a really big, wide-spanning species. They wanted to collect as much information as possible about what was known about monarchs and what was being collected. So they also used that to help inform that decision. In 2020, December of 2020, they did say they were a candidate species, they were warranted but precluded. And basically that meant that there were other species that had higher priority needs and actions at that time. And so that kind of brings us to where we're at today. And where we're at today is that we are waiting until December of 2024, and they will be announcing at some point in early December if a proposed rule, whether that's threatened or endangered, or if it is still warranted at that time. So that's kind of where we're at in the Endangered Species Act process. And in conjunction with that, whatever happens in December, which is quickly approaching, as we all know. If there is a decision on a proposed rule, there will likely be at least a year. There will be a period of comment on that. And then there will be a year time for the Fish and Wildlife Service to create what is known as their recovery plan. So there might not necessarily be something that is happening in an immediate status right after that decision in December. So there'll be a comment period. There will be a phase in which they're taking those comments and then creating their recovery plan from that, under the assumption that it is still warranted at that time. So it's a really interesting process. It's been 10 years, obviously, since it was originally proposed. Nothing has drastically changed in regards to the population, but they're evaluating what it looks like. So conservation of monarchs is going to continue and will continue, and with the work that you all are doing with that as well. So you know, we just kind of have to wait and see what that decision is going to be like, to see what will be happening from there. But the intention is that community science is a really valuable tool to collect monarch conservation data. So you know, there'll be there going to be a lot of different opportunities and things to consider, especially during the comment period and things of that nature. But they recognize that is a valuable tool, collecting a lot of valuable information. So that's kind of where we're at in the monarch listing and Endangered Species Act. I'm sure we'll have more information as December kind of rolls around as well. And yeah, I'll open it up to any of the other folks on the call, Karen or Annie or Caitlin.
Yeah, let's wait and see if people have questions, but that was a great summary, and we'll be happy, any of us, during this meeting in our small breakout groups or later on, if people have questions about this process. It's something we're obviously following really closely, but we'll keep you posted on it. But I can move into research now, Alyssa, if we want to.
That sounds great. And yeah, folks, you can keep using the Q&A. Oh, Chrissy did have, that's a good question. How might a federal ruling affect the California listing? You know, states are going to be, and I think Karen, you might be able to speak to this a little bit more in-depthly as well, but you know, if there is a listing decision, states are going to be in a large role of implementing a lot of that stuff as well. And so I don't know that it will necessarily change how California's regulation currently works in relation to that, or how, I guess it also depends how insects are defined in different state regulation as well. So I think those are parts of that. But how might a federal ruling affect the California listing? But also, to be clear too, sorry, and as I'm reading your question again, this decision will be for both populations, Eastern and Western. It's not going to be a separate decision for the Eastern versus the Western as well. So just for that clarification piece also, it'll affect all the monarchs. All right, so I'm going to scoot ahead so Karen can kind of touch a bit on cool research updates from all this amazing data that's been collected.
Yeah, so now there are getting to be dozens and dozens of papers written every year about monarchs. So it was actually really hard to choose some to summarize for you today, but I picked ones that I thought were really the most relevant to breeding habitat and breeding. So the most relevant to what we do in the MLMP. So one that I wanted to share because it directly uses MLMP data was this very cool project that was a collaborative project with the Field Museum in Chicago. And Field Museum employees reached out to people all over the city of Chicago and had them collect data on using MLMP protocols in their yards. And so for the years that they were doing this project, we were getting a lot of reports from Chicago. If we had done this wrap up and showed you that graph of states, Illinois would have been off the chart. So it was a really neat project. They looked at characteristics of milkweed gardens that led to there being more monarchs found in the garden. And I just summarized some of their main conclusions here. They found that residential land in an urban habitat can provide significant habitat for monarchs. And they found that the older the patch was, so patches that were more established and the milkweed was older and had spread around a little bit, and patches that contained common milkweed were more likely to contain eggs. So they divided the data into sites that had eggs and sites that didn't have eggs. And you were more likely to be in the have eggs category if you had common milkweed in your garden. So that was a pretty cool finding. And then if they looked at how many eggs were in the garden, they found that patches, again, that had common milkweed, that had more milkweed growing, and a higher diversity of blooming plants had more eggs. So it was a really nice kind of recipe for how we can create good habitat for monarchs in our gardens. We can put in common milkweed and we can have a diversity of blooming plants. So it's not really rocket science, but it was pretty neat that they came to this conclusion. And it was a great study that got published in a really reputable and high caliber journal.
Karen, there's
So
a quick
next slide.
there was a quick question on how many years what for the data collection for this paper.
They did it for 3 years, and they kind of modified the protocol because they were getting a lot of people involved. One of their goals was outreach and to get as many people as possible involved with, and this was a true community science project. This was the community of Chicago that was doing this. So it was a locally defined project. And so they had outreach goals and they provided people the milkweed plants if they wanted them. So they kind of changed the protocols over the time and how they collated the data. So in the end, we mostly worked with 2 years of data, but they do have 3 years. But most of our analyses are based on 2 years of data. Great question.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. I think Dennis has asked that. Thank you. All right, let's scoot on up to the next one.
Okay, the next one is about roadsides, and it's possible that you will get questions about the value of roadside habitat for monarchs. So we're kind of going from an urban garden to a roadside. And both of them we might think are not, we think of monarch habitat as maybe being a pristine prairie. But this was work that I had been involved with when I was still at the University of Minnesota. So I stayed involved as these teams were collecting data at the University of Minnesota. And there's 2 papers that were published out of that work that came out this year. And the first one, I circled the title for you on the slide, The Potential of Roadside Verges as Insect Habitat and the Impact of Road Salt. So habitat that's next to a road has the potential to be contaminated. There's a lot of gunk that goes onto roads. And in a lot of cases, if you've ever been on a freeway behind a salting truck that's just spewing out, tons of salt, literally, onto the road, there's a concern about how that will affect the plants that are growing on the side of the road. So this was an incredible study. The woman who was running this, Emily Snell-Rude, who is my colleague at University of Minnesota, I was a little skeptical about whether this would work, but she and her lab team reared over 2,500 caterpillars, or they got 2,500 adults out of this study. And while the larvae were feeding, they used real milkweed leaves and they put dissolved salt on the milkweed leaves at different levels that were typical of what they would find in the roadsides, because the milkweed sucks up the salt when it's growing. So they had 3 different salt levels that were realistic, what you would actually find growing in milkweed growing in roadsides. And what they found, kind of interestingly, is that the caterpillars that were fed the really high sodium diet excreted the sodium. So the frass had more sodium in it. And they found no effects on wing color. Sorry, I wrote wing. I just mean wing color, survival, body size, or parasite prevalence. So the salt did not have measurable impacts on the larvae. And they found they got 7 recoveries in Mexico, which sounds like a really low number. It is when they reared all of those monarchs. All those monarchs, they put tags on them. They sent them on their way to Mexico, and 7 of them got found. And monarchs in all 3 of the salt treatments got found in Mexico. So the suggestion is that roadsides do provide okay habitat for monarchs, at least in terms of the impacts that might come from road salt on those roadsides. And then the next study, if you just skip on down to the next slide, Alyssa, I'll circle the next one. So it's the same 2 pictures over there. This was another one that we did on what kinds of roadsides actually have more monarchs in them. So what are characteristics of roadsides that have more monarchs using them? And this was a study where we randomly picked, like literally used a random number generator to pick stretches, 50-meter stretches of roadside all over Minnesota. Went to 250 different roadside sites, took a long time to do this study. And they found that milkweeds were more likely to be found in roadsides next to crops and grasslands, and also in the southern and western part of Minnesota, where what we call our prairie potholes region of Minnesota. So that's not all that surprising that areas that are next to crops used to be prairies and grasslands. So milkweed could get into those areas. And there was more likely to be monarchs in sites that had more milkweeds, as milkweed density was higher. And also that the number of monarchs per plant was higher when milkweed densities were lower, showing that monarchs concentrate their eggs where there are fewer plants growing. So that was an interesting finding. And then this was another one that I was pretty satisfied with, because this is kind of what I thought would happen, is that monarch density per plant increased in areas that were farther from core grasslands. So what that is saying is that roadsides that are in a corn and soybean desert, if they're the only habitat around, you're more likely to find monarchs on them. So monarchs are finding these roadside sites, and if it's the only show in town, those are the roadsides that they're using more. So it was an interesting study. In a lot of places in the Midwest, those of you on this call who aren't from the Midwest, might not have a good sense. We are basically awash in fields of corn and soybeans. And that roadside habitat can be really important for monarchs. There are obviously risks, but what these studies showed is that they can provide important habitat. So just a couple more. The next one actually used both Journey North and MLMP data. And this paper looked at what might happen under climate change. So those of us in the North, we are not going to see monarchs breeding in the wintertime, at least not for a long time. All of us will be dead by the time it's warm enough for there to be monarchs in the winter here. But in the southern United States, with climate change, areas that are conducive to monarch breeding in the wintertime are moving further northward. So this study used climate change modeling to show how much further northward monarch breeding might occur. And the reason we're concerned about that is breeding in the wintertime leads to higher levels of OE, or the parasite OE. So what was found is that winter breeding will become more possible further north with climate change, which would increase the area of overlap between resident monarchs who stay there all winter and migratory monarchs that are coming back from Mexico. So it really highlights the need for people in the South to cut back their tropical milkweed in the wintertime to prevent this winter breeding that can transfer OE to the migratory part of the population. So hopefully this isn't too much getting thrown at you. I'm going to tell you about one more study. I hope that's okay. We can go down to the next slide. This is another one that I'm super excited about.
Karen, can I interrupt you for just 1 second? Because there was a question in here that kind of relates a little bit. So one of the things was just that somebody is based in central Texas, and they'd be interested to know like how to compare notes with others, because if they do have tropical milkweed, that they'll need to cut it back, and like when they would need to be doing that based off of like when monarchs have left and are moving through. So it kind of relates a bit to this, but I thought maybe you might be able to just kind of touch on that.
Yeah, I saw that question. It's really interesting. And the answer is really, it's very hard, because the thing with resident monarchs is they never leave. So cutting back your milkweed means there's a really good chance that you'll be cutting it back when there are monarchs on it that will become that resident population. So you can see why that's really complicated for people about cutting back their tropical milkweed. I know that this is hard, and I know that there's a lot of discussion about this, but the best thing would be possibly to gradually switch over to native milkweeds, which will die back at the right time. So you don't have to make those hard decisions about cutting back milkweed plants when there are monarchs on them, because there really is no time that you won't be killing some of the monarchs that are on the plants, or else having to bring them in your house and rear them. So yeah, it is not an easy question to answer. So that was my stumbling way to answer it.
Oh, thank you. That's great. Just wanted to kind of connected the dots there. So I mean, it's just really fascinating research. I mean, and to know that a lot of this comes from all of community science data. I think it's really, really valuable. There are going to be some other, I'm going to scoot up to the next one, and then I do have a couple of other related research paper questions just when you're done here.
Okay. So the next one you can't read about. We will send you links to all of these papers in our follow-up information. So all the papers that I just showed you. I can't do it to this one because it's still in press, but maybe by the time we put the notes together, it'll be out there. So this has been a super fun paper that I've been working on with a team at the university, at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And this is Karen Oberhauser entering the world of AI, which is quite an interesting thing. So there are thousands and thousands of monarch photos, monarch larvae right now on iNaturalist. 10 years ago, there were none. And now there are so many images on iNaturalist. So a group of us were interested in how we could use these photos to tell us more about monarchs. And what we did is we identified monarchs to Instar. So we took what we called a training database of 250 pictures of monarchs. And I was the one, because I've been looking at monarch caterpillars since 1984. I'm pretty good at distinguishing the instars when I can hold it in my hand, but I learned I was not that good at doing it when they were in a picture. I was okay until I got to fourth and fifth instars, and often I just couldn't tell. So that was an interesting thing for me to learn about myself. But what we did was first I came up with characteristics and I trained a team of real people, not AI people, real people to identify the larvae to instar. And then we gave all these pictures with our identifications to a computer with AI on it. This is where Naresh took over. But what we found is that AI was pretty good at identifying larval instars from these photos, pretty much as good as a person is. So what that means now is we're going to be able to track larval phenology because every one of these pictures has a date and a location stamp. So we'll be able to use these thousands of photos from iNaturalist observers all over the country or all over the world and learn a lot more about the phenology of monarchs. And I was just on the phone with Leslie Reese, who's one of the co-authors on this paper. And we're also going to start teaching AI how to identify the health of the caterpillar. So like that caterpillar in the third column, the second one down from the top that looks really black, that is a very unhealthy caterpillar. So we're going to train the computer how to identify not only instar, but larval health, which will be a pretty amazing source of data. So these are just some of the iNaturalist pictures that we worked with. They really ranged in quality. Some of them you could barely find the caterpillar, but it was a really fun project, and that'll be out pretty soon. We will send it to you as soon as it is out. All right, that's it for me. And then we can turn it over to Katie Lynn. I went kind of long here, sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I think we've got the Q&A there at the end. So I do wanna just gonna scoot up to Katie Lynn, but we will have time for some more of these questions at the end before we hop into the breakout room. So don't think we're forgetting about it.
Yep, and I'll be fast. Just have some reminders for you all as you start, well, taking a break for the winter, but then as you start thinking about when to start monitoring again next year. This year was a great reminder, especially with the data that Karen was showing earlier this year about how monarchs are kind of spotty in terms of how many there are throughout the year and from different sites, comparing one site to another. 0 is still a number, and it's a very important one. So keep collecting data, even if you aren't seeing monarchs. We can't know if monarchs are there unless someone is looking for them and telling us that they are there or not. So please, 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 as hard as it is to keep monitoring when you're not seeing things, it's still important that we collect those data. You can click through, Alyssa. I've got some pictures animated in here. Monarch density data collection is for monarchs outside, not the ones you are rearing indoors. So once you bring a monarch inside, don't report it for activity 1, which is the monarch density data. You can consider it has graduated to activity 3, which is monarch survival. And then avoid subdividing your sites. So, go back. There we go. If you have multiple people monitoring the same biologically similar site, or you monitor multiple areas within the same site, you should collate that data before entering. So put it all onto one master data sheet before you enter it into the MLMP data portal. It just streamlines things. Next slide. Pupae are only counted if they are on milkweed. If you see a pupa and it's not on milkweed, you can add it to your notes for the day, but don't include it in your monarch density record unless it is actually on milkweed, like the one in this photo, which I have never seen before, but one of our field team found that earlier this year, which was pretty cool. Keep the monarchs you are rearing for activity 3 the Monarch survival activity in their own individual containers. I have a picture of that, Alyssa. You can click through to that animation. This helps us and helps you especially keep the information on those individual monarchs straight. So remember, those containers should be labeled with all of the information needed for the data sheet. So the date it was collected, the stage it was collected at, and the location if it was different from your MLMP site. And that information follows that individual monarch throughout its entire life cycle until you record it on your data sheet. Speaking of data, we encourage you to submit your data right away if possible. It's less work for you, and it's any mistakes and fix them right away. And it allows us to track Monarch numbers in real time. So if you're waiting until the end of the summer to submit all your data, it's harder for us to track those data in real time because we're waiting until September or October before we can see it all. So please submit your data right away if possible. And as always, if you have any questions, please contact us. We are always happy to help. We are just an email away. Next slide.
1 second. So
Yeah.
there's two quick questions in relation to the pupa and milkweed. So
Yep.
first one is how to report pupa that are not on milkweed. What's the process for that?
You can put them in the notes section on your data sheet. There's not a spot on the data sheet like in the chart in the table to record them because we're only looking at monarchs on milkweed for those data. But you can record that you found a pupa in the notes section because it's still something that's interesting for us to know and for us to learn more about what monarchs are doing in the milkweed patch. But you're only recording the pupa on the chart of your data sheet if it's actually on the milkweed. And then I saw that other question, how often or likely is it for monarchs to pupate on the milkweed? It's very low. It's not very common at all. They typically move off the milkweed plant. It's not so uncommon that obviously we have pictures of it, but it's really not common at all. They typically will move off the milkweed plant.
And
were there
also,
more questions related?
Just one more quick question. So there's folks that are still entering data from the spring. Do you still use that data? Monitoring 3 sites and just got behind this year, which
Yes, we do.
question.
Sorry, I had to let my dog in. We still use the data. So please continue to submit it, even if you think you're late. We'd rather have it late than not at all. So please still continue. We're just trying to put reminders out there that it tends to be easier for you if you report it right away. But if you haven't yet, continue to do so. We will use the data.
We haven't done any big analyses of the data. So while we're downloading it, and I use it like to show you the graphs from today, we show reporters, we show government officials, but we haven't done any detailed analyses yet. We wait a good number of months for the stragglers.
Yeah. Yeah, like there's a comment in here that they're still seeing monarchs and monarch eggs in October, so in Texas. So yes, we obviously know that, even though Karen and Annie and I are up in the upper Midwest and monarchs are hopefully long gone by now, and on their way to Mexico. Not every state is Minnesota or Wisconsin, obviously. So okay, next slide.
I scooted it. Didn't I?
Keep going.
There we go.
Okay. And I had this one last, I guess, suggestion or idea for you all. Some other ways to help monarchs and to help the monarch conservation community. Many of you on this call today, and many of people who aren't, who might be watching this later, you've been monitoring for a long time. Thank you for all of your time and effort and data that you've submitted. Please let us know if you'd like more information on becoming an MLMP trainer in your area to be a resource for others in your area, or if you'd like to just generally be a resource for other MLMP volunteers in your area, maybe not necessarily a trainer to run trainings, but can people contact you if they have questions about what's going on with milkweed in your area? And then we also have other volunteer opportunities apart from monitoring, such as helping with the newsletter, spot checking data. So if you're interested in helping with any of that kind of stuff, just reach out to us, info@mlmp.org. Annie will get that, and then we can help you find the right fit for you, and overall help the project as well. So thank you for all of your time and efforts this monitoring season, and we're excited to see all of your data as it comes in, and see you all again next year as well. There were a lot more questions that came in when I was talking.
There were quite a few more questions that came in. I'm actually gonna I'm gonna quit sharing my screen here because all I've got left is this Q&A, and I can kind of see you, or some of you, all a bit better. But I do want to give a few minutes just to answer a couple of questions in one or two questions in a big group before we scoot into breakout rooms. So there were a couple questions in here, and I'll pose them out to everybody. So I did there's just one other question on just kind of that clarification for the pupa and milkweed combination here. So I do want to make sure that we can clarify that for you. So if you can only count a pupa if it's on a milkweed plant, does that mean we can't count it if the caterpillar crawled off of the milkweed and pupated on the stalk of a flower or bush within the patch being monitored? And I believe in that instance, you will have likely already counted that caterpillar on your milkweed plant in a previous week of that survey. And then you would just note that you saw that pupa in the notes. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yep.
A couple of other quick questions, because they kind of connect back to the research studies. Karen, I just wanted to touch on those. One of them was how and when do you think that we can determine the benefits versus risks of roadside habitat, on when it's a good idea to have it or not?
Yeah, Jen, that's a really good question, and there is a lot of conversation about that. You know, roadside habitat is not as good as a big pristine prairie, but in many areas of the country, it's all that we have. So we know that there is some mortality due to collisions with vehicles, and that, you know, the milkweed is often mowed, so there's a risk from mowing that milkweed. So, but overall, when we kind of do the analyses, monarchs do come out of roadside habitat. So more survive or some survive. And if it's an area where there just is no other habitat around, that will add to the monarch population. So there have been some theoretical studies of that, assuming pretty realistic mortality rates that are due to the roadsides themselves. And in areas where there isn't any roadside habitat, the output is lower. So the roadsides help, even though they're not as good as non-roadside habitat, if that makes sense. It's better than nothing.
Good question. One other quick question, just kind of talking about the research again. Talked about research, but didn't state kind of where or if the data had come. All of the research that you were talking about today was utilizing community science data, correct?
Yeah, and not all. Great question. I saw that too. Thanks, Dennis. It's across the board. So Journey North, MLMP, the Monarch tagging program. So it's a combination of citizen involvement. The specific ones to the MLMP were the Chicago study that I talked about, and the one that looks at winter breeding. So that one looked at winter breeding incidents from MLMP. So we have a lot of volunteers in the southern United States that are documenting monarch presence during the winter. And people are also documenting that to Journey North. So we combined Journey North and MLMP data for that one. The roadside studies used the methods of the MLMP, but they were done by university people, because we didn't feel like we should be asking MLMP volunteers to go out on roadsides. Not that safe. So, and this is just research that was published in 2024. We have a bigger summary of MLMP research on our website from all the years of the project.
I think there's at least 31 papers that are listed on that, on the MLMP website too, that you can go back and reference. And I just to remember today too, and that was a question that was in there. Yeah, we'll make sure that we follow up with all the papers that are referenced in here too, so that you have access to that stuff. I know there's a specific question about the Chicago one. I know there's more questions kind of in the Q&A box here, but I do want to give time to have some smaller groups. So myself, Karen, Annie, and Katie, we're all gonna kind of hop into a breakout room with you. You can keep adding questions into the Q&A, and we'll do our best in our follow-up as well to answer those. But we're gonna do a quick kind of 10-minute breakout room, then we'll come all back together at the end, and we can kind of take that time to share our experiences, answer any questions in kind of a small group, and give you guys the time to come off a mute instead of listening to us this whole time. So I'm gonna go ahead and start those, and then you'll be lucky enough to see who you get in your room. So if your fingers crossed for Karen, you might be out of luck. I don't know. But we'll see. And so you'll see that pop up on your screen here in just 1 second.
Oh, we're right in the middle of
So
a
short.
question and comment. I know.
That was very short.
Christy was cut off mid-sentence.
It was 10
Audra, we
minutes.
almost done
I
talking.
swear.
It was 10 minutes. I know it was, but I wasn't keeping close track of the time.
We ended on a cliffhanger. The question was asked, and then boom, we were kicked right out. So it was a movie cliffhanger that Katie Lynn has to finish up.
It's just to keep you coming back. That's why we did that.
So the question was, and maybe Karen or Alyssa or Annie can chime in on this too. If so in somebody's yard, their backyard is their site, but they see a butterfly, a monarch butterfly in their front yard, do they record that as a butterfly sighting as they're monitoring, or is it separate?
I would say yes, because it's still your yard, and that kind of gets at the point you made earlier, Katie Lynn, that we don't want you to have a whole bunch of different sites. So you can consider your yard your site. And even though you do most of your monitoring in your backyard, you know, as long as you don't think that butterfly is going to fly around and get double counted in your backyard, it would still be okay to count it. And that would be, you know, then maybe if you add milkweed to your front yard, that would become a part of your site in the future. So, yeah. We say unless it's biologically different, if there's a biological reason to separate them, then you would, like if your front yard was a big pond and it had or swamp milkweed and the backyard was drier, then you might make it 2 sites. But if they're relatively similar, then they would be 1 site. Maybe we can all do our cliffhanger questions in each of our breakout groups. We had a cliffhanger question at the end about somebody had been looking at the data from the eastern part of the United States, and that they were seeing higher numbers in the east. And that does happen in some years. The relative contribution of different parts of the country is different because of weather conditions. So it really highlights the need to have habitat everywhere. Because in some years, the Midwest will be better, and some years the Northeast will be better. And, you know, our goal is to produce as many monarchs as possible. Sorry, I'm being very Eastern population centric. So those of you from California, sorry about that, Christy. So we need the habitat everywhere. The thing is, though, that we usually get fewer monarchs coming from the Northeast. So that's, you know, a good year for them in the Northeast is not as good as a really great year in the Middle West, where there's more habitat for them. So that was our cliffhanger question. Anyone else have a cliffhanger?
Well, we had a cliffhanger comment. Christy, do you want to finish that thought? It was literally mid-sentence that we got popped out.
All right, sorry about that. I was trying to find my microphone. I was just typing it in the chat just in case, but I'll just tell you. So out here in California, our monitoring, most of the monitoring is on narrowleaf milkweed. That is our kind of prevalent native milkweed. And we are in, a lot of urban area, but mixed with, the National Mountain Range right here, 2 miles from the sites that we are monitoring. So we've got a mix of open wild space and urban kind of coming together. And one of the milkweeds that we're monitoring is really interesting. It's called pine needle milkweed, or A. linaria. And that milkweed is evergreen. It's a native plant to the Mojave Desert here in California. We've had a lot of interest in it. And that milkweed ended cycling just like the native milkweeds. They also have not gone completely dormant yet. But it was a hard stop. So we had, heavy breeding cycles, kind of like you guys. We saw a lot of getting to the third instars, not much later for a lot of the summer, but a lot of breeding, a lot of monarchs flying around, and end of August, just done, hard stop. They just left, which is somewhat typical. And then during that peak migration that's on that beautiful map that floats around, with a lot of the organizations, we usually see them come back. We expect those are the migrators, and we were ready to see them, and it just never happened. We saw maybe less than a handful that came through, and I'm talking like multiple areas spread throughout LA County. This is sort of our observation, but what's so interesting is that they did not continue to cycle on the evergreen plants, not even the tropical milkweeds. We're not seeing a lot of that like we do in the past year. So that's something different for this year.
Wow. They never stop teaching us, do they, Christy?
No, and this is the year that like we have the ability to tag again in California, and we don't have any monarchs. We did do our first counts. They did early counts for Xerces here, and there are monarchs showing up, but it's going to appear that it's not much different than what you guys are having with the Eastern, that our numbers are going to be lower this year.
Did you have a cliffhanger, Alyssa?
We didn't necessarily have a cliffhanger. We had a complicated site. Kind of that I was recommending that they likely contact you and Annie about. But Henry, if you wanted to explain your site a little bit, feel free. Otherwise, I think he might be reaching out to you guys to kind of discuss the best ways to be doing efforts at his site over 30. It's about 35 acres, so just a really large space to be monitoring. So just kind of the best aspects for handling such a large site, because it's a time consuming and intensive effort sometimes. So, also recognizing that and shouting out thank you to all of you, that we know it can be time consuming and we know it can be an intensive effort, but man, is it worth the while? And just always thank you for that. But Henry, if you'd like to explain your site a little bit, please feel free. But if you just want to send an email, that works out as well too.
No,
And
I don't mind.
Oh, go ahead.
I've been in contact with you, Karen, a couple of years ago about this problem, because the site is approximately 5 acres in size, and it's dominated with milkweed and a fall goldenrod. And I've got 3 plots in that 5-acre site that I monitor. So you told me back when I spoke to you previously that there's so much milkweed in just 3 little square meters. The chances of catching a monarch in there is pretty small, except I do mow a path through the field and around the field, and always having fresh milkweed coming up. And that's where I find lots of eggs, because the milkweed is always fresh all through the summer. And so when I turn in my results for my monitoring, it doesn't really capture how many monarchs I'm seeing, or I should say how many eggs or caterpillars I'm seeing, because I'm seeing them where I'm in places where I don't monitor.
Yeah, you have an interesting situation. That happened at the very first MLMP site. We did mowing and there was new milkweed coming up. So we do, there are a lot of ways to address that. You could like do random walks through your site, and that would include some areas on the mode paths and some areas that aren't on the mode paths. I know it's hard because I remember from talking before that it would be hard for you to walk through your whole site. But what we used to do at our site, we had like a 30-acre site, the first MLMP site, and it included paths. So we set up transects through the site. So we monitored some of the milkweed on the paths and some of the milkweed in the unmowed areas. But I think as long as you're clear in explaining to us, like next year, if you start doing some monitoring in the paths, just as long as you tell us you're doing that, then we would know that when we're analyzing your data. And I'd be happy again to look at a picture of your site and work on that again.
Okay, so I think I started in 2007 monitoring, and I didn't know that if I added more sites to it, and you compared it to previous years, whether it would, you make me question whether I'm do it accurately, because you'll see a big jump in the numbers.
Yep, that's why we have that. We have a question on, is there anything different this year? And we definitely look at that when we're doing the analyses.
Okay.
There's something different about this year. If the site is being managed differently, you're monitoring differently. Yeah.
Okay. Then next season, I'll start watching those areas.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you, Henry. Thank you for touching on that, Karen. I'm noticing folks are got commitments, and I'm recognizing that we're 3 minutes over time. We crammed a lot in to a little short period of time. So I'm going to turn it over to Annie for just some final thoughts.
Yeah, we just want to thank you all for making the time and being with us here today, being such attentive listeners and sharing out in the breakout rooms in the time that we had. And really just to reiterate how important the work you are doing is for monarch conservation. So please keep monitoring, keep telling others about it, and stick with us, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, we'll send a wrap up and we will get to all of your questions.
We have them documented and we will answer
thank
them.
you.
Yeah, it was really great to see everybody. I love being in touch with all of you. So thanks, and kudos to you. Good to see you. Yeah, Christy, a lot of good friends out here.
So many familiar names and faces. It's great.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.